Good afternoon, everyone. Maupay nga kulop haaton nga tanan. Welcome back to Bati UP Tacloban. Today, we present the second episode of Mana Bana. This Mana Bana episode is also part of the Living Gender Conversation series, which explores themes and narratives about the lived experiences of gender. This is Popo Amascual, and today we have with us Assistant Professor Pierce Docena, a faculty member of the Division of Social Sciences in UP Tacloban. Maupay nga kulop, Sir Pierce.
Maupay nga kulop gihapay mo Popo, and good afternoon to all the listeners of Bati UP Tacloban.
Yes, I'm really excited about our conversation this afternoon, Sir Pierce. So, before we start, can you tell our audience what this will be all about? And please also tell us how this topic draws upon your research interests.
Okay, so thank you Popo. I'm also excited, just like you, about our topic this afternoon, which is entitled Walang Ganon Mars, Myths and Misconceptions about LGBT People. So as you've said earlier, this is part of our Living Gender Conversation series. And this particular topic really is relevant to me both at a personal and a professional level. So, personally, I identify as a cisgender gay man, and my professional activities have mostly been related to the lives and experiences of LGBT people. I also teach LGBT psychology in UP Tacloban, among other psychology courses. I'm a founding member of the Psychological Association of the Philippines, or PAP, LGBT Psychology Special Interest Group. The aim of our group is to promote LGBT rights and well being through research, education, advocacy, and practice. I have also published a couple of articles on LGBT psychology, particularly on the coming out stories of young Waray women. And just recently, I completed a research project on the lives of LGBT Yolanda survivors living in permanent resettlement site communities in Tacloban. And this was funded by the Commission on Human Rights in Region 8. And on top of this, I also do advocacy work for LGBT rights and well-being, mainly through trainings, workshops for various government and non-government organizations.
Wow. So I can really say, based on that uh, introduction of yours regarding this topic, that it is really closely related to you. It's very close to your heart, right, Sir Pierce? And
Yes, yes,
speaking
right.
of the topic, I would just like to uh, bring to our attention the reason why we're doing this episode for Bati UP Tacloban. So this Mana Bana episode is uh, again part of the celebration of the Women's Month here in UP Tacloban. And we'd like to believe that women's issues are rooted upon gender. And this episode of Manabana will talk about gender and sexual minorities, especially about the LGBT people. So I'm coming from my personal experience as a member of the LGBT community, and I know you, Sir Pierce, can also relate to certain experiences that we encounter everywhere on account of our gender identity or on account of our gender. So we have people who discriminate us or simply just tease us even along the roads. And these people who tend to be very uh, discriminatory or very harsh on people of the LGBT community are not really aware about our experiences. So, with that, it's really nice to know more about this presentation of yours entitled Walang Ganon Mars, Myths and Misconceptions about LGBT People. So this afternoon, we will be talking about these different misconceptions about the LGBT community, and we will be using factual evidence to debunk them, so to speak. Regarding that previous thought that I gave about how people tend to judge or misjudge members of the LGBT community, it's probably also because they don't understand the nature of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, or SOGIE. So uh, it's nice if we begin our conversation with these thoughts, these ideas. One thing that's quite alarming is when people think or treat being a member of the LGBT community as a disease or a mental illness that needs to be cured. So, what can we say about this, Sir Pierce?
Yes, you're actually correct, Popo. This is actually very alarming, and this has this one of the very old myths, so to speak. When it comes to LGBT people, that um, a lot of people think that being LGBT is a disease or a mental illness, and to set the record straight, no pun intended. Uh, it's this is a myth basically. So the fact is that being LGBT is not a disease. It's not a mental illness. And I'm glad that you said that we will be drawing upon scientific evidence, research that has been conducted while we are talking about these misconceptions. No, and if you actually look at reputable scientific organizations, uh, sobrang tagal na nawala or na decategorize, na depathologize ang homosexuality. In fact, homosexuality was officially removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, of the American Psychiatric Association in 1973. Okay, so can you imagine, 1973 pa po, wala na siya dun sa classification ng DSM. And especially for those who are into psychology or psychiatry even, they know that the DSM is sort of the Bible, so to speak, or the go-to resource when it comes to mental illnesses or diseases. So wala na siya doon. Okay? And in 1992, the World Health Organization also removed homosexuality from its international classification of diseases. So these two reputable mental health or health organizations have already taken a stand. And that stand is definitely based on decades of research that shows that indeed being LGBT is not a disease or mental illness. Now, some people might actually ask, well, but I noticed that a lot, or maybe some can even say most LGBT people I know usually exhibit certain mental health issues, okay, or psychopathologies like depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues. So, well, that is correct. Okay, so there are definitely LGBT people who exhibit mental health issues or psychopathologies. But what we need to understand is that these mental health issues are not necessarily because of their SOGI, or not necessarily due to their sexual orientation or their gender identity. In fact, studies show that the mental health issues faced by a lot of LGBT people are really due to the stigma and prejudice that they experience precisely because of their identity, which
Mm.
is, as we know, marginalized in our society. So, kung meron mang, sabi nga nila, kung meron mang may mali or may sakit, it's not the LGBT person, but it is actually our society, which is very heterosexist.
Mm. And uh, if I may ask, Sir Pierce, previously it was it was considered as a mental disorder because of it being sexual deviation. Tama ba? Is it correct, Sir Pierce? And uh, for them, the symptoms of this mental illness or this disorder was actually a typical sexual behavior or these non-procreative sexual behavior. Am I correct?
Yes, in a sense, yun yung pinanggagalingan. Because actually, if we talk about mental disorder or psychological disorder from the lens of psychology, we look at it from different categories and
Mm.
one or criteria. Okay, and one of those criteria would be, whether the behavior is atypical, okay, or
Mm.
it's not normative. Okay, it's not exhibited by the majority of the population. And we know for a fact that LGBT people definitely belong to a minority because when we go by the numbers, mas marami naman talaga yung mga heterosexuals. And that is just one category. Okay, but if we look at other categories and like, does that particular identity bring distress, personal distress to the person? Like, does it affect the person's job, the person's relationships with other people? Okay, ito na yung parang deal breaker in a sense. No? Because for a lot of LGBT people, their identity is not really a hindrance. It doesn't
Mm.
stop them
True.
from relating well with other people. Okay, so I go back to my earlier point that their problems really are rooted mostly from their experiences with a very heterosexist environment, a very heterosexist culture that perpetuates stigma, prejudice, and allows discrimination to happen.
So in a sense, Sir Pierce, we should be alarmed more with the offshoots of this mindset of people who treat uh, being a member of the LGBT community as a disease, right? Because
Yes,
uh, whenever you are condemned or criminalized for being an LGBT person, it's really how the stress that comes with it that becomes a problem. So it's not so much how you who you are and how you present yourself that's a problem. It's really more of how other people around you deal with with your identity, and it's really stemming from their ignorance and their lack of empathy.
that's correct. That's correct, Popo. And if I may just add, and it's good that you actually mentioned the word stress. This reminds me uh, of a theory, a model actually in psychology uh, by Ilan Mayer, who is an American psychologist, who came up with what he called as the minority stress model. So,
Mm.
in a nutshell, what this model is, or this theory is telling us, is that uh, we have basically two kinds of stressors or stresses. Okay, one would be general stressors, and
Mm.
nobody is exempted from this. No, so this would include, our concerns about our health, about our family relationships, and even minor, inconveniences like, like traffic or I don't know, probably like even work or pollution, things like that. So whether you're straight or LGBT, we all experience general stressors. However, we also have what we call as minority stress. And these kinds of stressors are specific to uh, people who belong to minority groups. And in our case, we're talking about LGBT people, sexual and gender minority groups.
Mm.
So this stress, again, comes from the fact that we live in a heterosexist society. So you can imagine that LGBT people have general stressors or they experience general stress, but on top of this, they also experience minority stress, which is
Mm.
not necessarily the case with straight people, for example. Kasi wala naman silang concerns about being teased, about being bullied for their identity, precisely because of their being heterosexual. So, kumbaga, nagkapatong-patong yung general
Yes,
stress
yes.
plus minority stress. So, what do you expect?
Mm.
Definitely, LGBT people will probably exhibit certain mental health issues like anxiety, depression, and many other issues. Okay, but again, we go back to our point that it's not because of their identity. It is
Yeah.
because of their experiences with our society, with this heterosexist culture.
And talking about all these layers of stress, it's really not surprising that uh, people who used to be diagnosed, I say that with quotation marks, of being a person with a mental disorder and or a person who identifies as an LGBT person would only want to be cured. Again, quotation marks included. So it brings us to that idea that to that myth that being a member of the LGBT community can actually be cured, or being an LGBT person can be remedied.
Yes, Popo. So that's another myth. No?
Yes,
Again, this is a myth. When we say that being LGBT can be unlearned or it can be cured, and this is connected with the first
the
myth
first one.
that
Yes,
we tried to
discussed.
debunk, right? So, if you look at the scientific literature again, so scientific professional organizations have already taken a stand on this matter that treatments that claim to quote unquote cure homosexuality or being LGBT are just successful in coercing heterosexual behavior and not
Mm.
necessarily in changing a person's inner feelings about their sexual orientation.
So
And in
instead,
fact,
my understanding there, sir, is that instead of you, what's this, like in as a concept, stopping yourself from being gay, instead you are being forced to act straight. Is that correct?
yes, yes,
Ah,
that's
okay,
true.
okay.
So, iba kasi yun eh. Iba yung behavior, iba din naman yung orientation. Diba? And like I've already mentioned earlier that most, actually a lot of psychological, mental health organizations worldwide, such as the American Psychological Association, British Psychological Society, Canadian Psychological Association, and including our very own Psychological Association of the Philippines, okay, and many others. Okay, these reputable scientific professional organizations have already taken a stand against this conversion or reparative therapy. Okay, so, for example, the CPA or the Canadian Psychological Association, in their resolution or in their policy statement, they said that based on research, the research does not support the efficacy of conversion or reparative therapy. In fact, these kinds of therapies can result in negative outcomes such as distress, anxiety, depression, negative self-image, etc. So mas makakapagpalala pa siya, okay? Rather than quote-unquote correcting sexual orientation. And there's no strong, robust evidence that the negative effects of conversion or reparative therapy counterbalance any distress caused by the social stigma and prejudice that these LGBT individuals may experience.
It's really shocking to me to hear from you, Sir Pierce, what these experts have to say about the idea of treating something that's not a disease, not something that needs to be treated. And in fact, I encountered one source that what's this? introduced me to the visually keyed shocker. It's something that they use as an aversion therapy, in which they make use of a slide projector that shows images that may, include homosexual acts, and if it what's this, stimulates the viewer, there is a shock that will be introduced to them, so that they will then be conditioned to react differently to it. And then that's what I understood as to the cure of this aversion therapy. So uh, is it correct to say that instead of curing, you are in fact adding more problems to something that's actually normal?
Yes, that's correct. No, and what you mentioned, yung aversion therapy. That's, these are, terrible examples of how certain people, under the guise, no, of quote unquote treating someone, or curing someone, does more damage in the end. Because can you imagine administering electrical shocks to a person, for example? So that's that's really very inhumane,
Yeah,
and rather than actually helping the person, you're actually creating more trauma.
yeah,
Okay, and regarding this particular myth that that being LGBT can be unlearned, that this is actually connected to to that idea that our sexuality can be learned. Okay?
yeah,
So if you actually think about it, so if that is our premise, no, so does that also mean that being straight can also be learned or unlearned, diba? Right? And if you think about it that way, and for a lot of people, if you ask them, can you unlearn being straight? Can you cure yourself of
yeah,
heterosexuality? It's a preposterous
yeah,
idea,
yeah.
right? And then the
And
myth crumbles down.
yeah, and what also saddens me, Sir Pierce, is how maybe this idea that it has to be cured was really just instilled upon LGBT people, and that uh, to begin with, if they were just allowed to freely be themselves, they wouldn't even think about unlearning being gay, or they wouldn't even want to be cured of something that other people do not fear or do not misunderstand. So I think that's also another point to be made about this myth, that it shares that layer with the first one, in that a lot of the problem is really coming from the people around you, external forces, rather than the person who is clearly simply identifying himself or herself as the person they truly are.
Yes, yes. And if actually if we again unpack that particular myth or that particular belief about one SOGIE being learned and therefore it
Can be
being
unlearned.
unlearned.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you think about it, even if we go by that particular premise, I think nobody in his right mind would want to learn, quote unquote, how to be LGBT, right?
Yeah.
Knowing what is in
Yeah.
store for him or her,
That is
knowing
true.
how stigmatized this particular identity is, knowing that you're growing up and you will most likely be bullied, be teased, discriminated against. You will not, enjoy certain rights, privileges that heterosexuals enjoy or even take for granted. Who would want to learn to be LGBT in the first place, right?
Yes, that's true. And uh and again, for me, it's right that we started this conversation with all these myths related to the nature of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, because I think these two myths really allow us to understand these basic information about how it is to be an LGBT person. or how to belong to the community, or and and given these ideas that we've exchanged regarding the two myths that we presented, I would like us to zero in on myths about least represented members of the LGBT community now, Sir Pierce. So,
Okay.
yeah. And one of these least represented members of the LGBT community are bisexuals. And for a lot of people, bisexuals are just confused about their true sexual identity. So that's the myth that bisexuals are just in a phase they can't decide who they are, and that they have to decide finally who they are.
Yes, and unfortunately, again, this is quite a popular myth again. But we go back to our point that that is a myth. You know, bisexuality is recognized as quote unquote true, or perhaps the better word is valid sexual orientation, just as valid as being lesbian or gay or even being heterosexual. Okay, so bisexual people are not not confused, they are not fence sitters, they are not undecided. Okay? I think this if you think about this myth, this really stems from, again, our lack of understanding of bisexual people's lives and experiences. Admittedly, due to fewer research that has been conducted among bisexual populations compared, for example, with research that has been conducted among gay men or even lesbians. Okay? Uh, on top of that, we also do not have a lot of out bisexual public figures. Okay, unlike, for example, when we talk about, again, gay men or even trans people, you can probably name um, quite a number of them, okay, in the mass media or public figures. Okay, and this seeming invisibility of bisexual people in mainstream society contributes to the perpetuation of this uh, myth. Okay, and also I think that is also because a lot of bisexual people, whether these are bisexual men or bisexual women, can quote unquote pass for straight people. Okay? Kasi nga bisexual sila. So for example, a bisexual man can be in a relationship with a woman. Okay? And nobody would probably suspect that he is, he identifies as bisexual, and probably people will just say, well, this is a straight guy, okay, or a straight girl for a bisexual woman. Okay? And because of this lack of representation, then this particular myth is, perpetuated in our society.
Yeah, and I would just like to take something from what you just said, Sir Pierce, regarding representation in the media, and even simply, having celebrities who are bisexuals, being open or being out. And that perhaps another thing about it is that whenever celebrities who are bisexual come out, uh, heterosexual heterosexuals tend to fantasize or glamorize their bisexuality, because there's the idea that, I think there's the tendency to make a fantasy out of the bisexuality, and it confuses the understanding about the experiences of bisexual people, in that this is not a phase that you can experiment on or experiment with in order for you to just have, sexual fun or just have fun. And that you think uh 10 years down the road, they will end up becoming heterosexual. So I think there's a problem there as well, and that problem is also caused by how they are portrayed in Hollywood and in mass media, and that they are these. uh, people with no trace of being LGBT people.
Yes,
So
yes. I would actually agree that there's really a need for us to work on representation, especially on mass media when it comes to LGBT representation, specifically yung mga least represented members of the LGBT community, like bisexual people. Uh, and the sad thing is that our social institutions, and that would include the mass media, are partly to blame for the perpetuation of these wrong beliefs or these misconceptions about bisexuals, for example. Kaya nga, di ba may mga statements tayo na mga buy now, gay
gay
later,
later,
right?
yeah,
Which is,
yeah,
some people find it funny, but actually for a lot of bisexual people, that could actually be quite insulting. That, well, not quite insulting, that's actually insulting. So
very insulting.
it's
Yeah,
almost, it not only denigrates their identity, the message really there is that you're not uh,
you're
you're
in
not yet
limbo. That you're
sure,
yeah.
right?
It's just
You're
it's a
confused.
transition. It's just a
Yeah,
phase, and that I think it also what also adds to that is the idea that a lot of many bisexuals used to be confused, or like homosexuality was a transitional phase for them before coming out as bisexuals. So maybe that also adds to the idea that perhaps it is simply an a moment or a phase for them to, you know, figure out who they are, which is not necessarily the case. Which is not the case.
yeah. But again, because if we go back to our definition, what is a bisexual or who is bisexual? So bisexuals really are people who are attracted romantically, sexually, emotionally to both men and women. Okay, so this attraction does not necessarily have to happen at the same time. So
Yeah.
just because a bisexual person, for example, a bisexual woman is in a relationship with a man, it doesn't necessarily, mean that she's no longer bisexual. Okay,
Yeah.
just so happens that at that point she is in a relationship with the opposite gender. Okay, but she's still bisexual precisely because she still has certain attractions to women. Okay, and it doesn't have to be both at the same time.
Yeah, and she doesn't necessarily have to act upon these attractions at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, I think that was really enriching for me because I've never really dived deeper into uh, bisexuality as a topic. So, however, this next myth is really what can I say? Uh, Personal, very personal for me because it's about another least represented member of the LGBT community, and they are the transgenders. So, uh, for most people, they think that transgenders wish to have their genitals changed, and that someone is not transgender unless they medically transition.
Yes, actually, thank you for pointing that out, Popo. That this is a very erroneous belief again, and actually, now that you mentioned it, especially that you said that this is something that is personally relevant to you, something that is close to your experience. I'm actually thinking, before I even say something about this particular myth, I think it might even be better if if you address this. And what do you think about this particular myth? Because I think this, you will add more authenticity, uh, to this conversation if we highlight, that trans experience or the trans voice, so to speak. So, I mean, what do you think? I would want to hear from you first before I say something about, this particular myth.
Okay. So, uh, from my personal experience, I would always get asked a lot if I've already uh, undergone this any medical uh, transitionary procedure. Is that correct, Sir Pierce? Is the term correct?
Yeah,
So
gender
gender
affirming
conforming
surgery.
or gender
Yeah,
affirming procedures. So, and most of the time, whenever I say I don't have lady parts, they would either feel uh, disgusted, like someone who I'm planning to date. This particular says context is the one that I usually deal with when it comes to uh, you know being asked about medically transitioning. So it's usually in a dating context. And aside from that kind of reaction, uh, many of them would follow up the disgust with, trying to correct me by saying, "You're just gay. You're not trans. Do not say you're trans because you have not undergone any medical procedure in order for you to be fully a woman." And I think to complete that sentence is really the phrase "in their eyes." You mean because uh, personally, given that kind of retort, or given the idea of the choice to go under the knife, I wouldn't want to medically transition with an operation. I personally do not want to undergo gender affirming surgery. And for me, I am as woman as any other woman out there with lady parts. And I know I am a woman because I act, talk, dress, and think like one, regardless of my private parts or my uh, sexual organs. So, yeah, I think it's not necessary for you to undergo medical transition. Even
yeah,
though, by the way, even though I am actually undergoing hormone replacement therapy, I'm taking birth control pills, and I've been doing so since October last year. And this has been the only medical procedure that I have undergone in order for me to feel more reaffirmed of my gender identity. But in terms of like, uh, what's this? Going under the knife, getting sexual reassignment surgery, it's not something that I am thinking about now or even anytime soon. But I'm not saying that's a final decision. But for now, I'm happy the way I am. So with or without lady parts.
yeah. Oh, thank you very much, Popo, actually, for for sharing that very personal part of yourself, and for sharing also a part of your thoughts, your very deep innermost experiences, and indeed your vulnerabilities to to us in this conversation. And I think this makes this conversation even more authentic and even more powerful. But I do agree with what you said, that it has nothing to do with one's body parts or with one's genitals or biological physiological mechanisms, because the fact is that people can be transgender even if they don't take hormones, even if
Mm.
they haven't had gender affirming surgery. And in fact, there are a lot of people who identify as trans who have not had gender affirming surgery, and they are completely at peace with with their body. Okay, and they don't have plans, and they are still a man or a woman to them, because that is their gender identity. And here I'd like to emphasize really that when we talk about being transgender is, is a gender identity. And being trans is a matter of identity and not necessarily a matter of how one looks or what one has in one's body. In fact, if we talk about the definition of gender identity, really is it's a psychological, it's a deep-seated psychological understanding of who you are. So do you think of yourself as a woman, as a man, or something else? And only you can answer that question, regardless of what you have in your body, regardless of what people tell you who you are. You're the only one who can answer that question because that is your gender identity. So even if there are certainly some trans people who decide to go for gender affirming surgery, that's their personal decision, and that is a decision that they make now, for them to feel more comfortable about their identity. And for many of these people, that is their way of aligning their identity with uh, what society traditionally thinks of as male or female or masculine or feminine. Okay, but not all trans people, okay, decide to medically transition.
Yeah. And I would just like to add, Sir Pierce, that researchers at Boston University School of Medicine conducted a review of the current studies on the transgender existence, and that they concluded that the available data suggests there's a biological link to a person's gender identity. So this indicates that trans people are essentially assigned genders at birth that don't match their inherent biologically set identity. Something that's more important to realize here is that some, but not all, trans people require but can't access medical care. So maybe this has to also be highlighted in this discussion about one of the least represented members of the LGBT community, because even if, let's say, a transgender woman wants to undergo genital construction surgery, she cannot do so because she doesn't have the resources to make her undergo the procedure. And that just goes to show how lacking government support we have, in how the even if you want to, because you're actually experiencing severe gender dysphoria, or a state of emotional distress, when you feel like you're not in the right body and you want to change uh, how you look because of this distress, and you will only feel better if you undergo, say, genital construction surgery. Even though you have all of these problems, you cannot do so because you don't have the money. You don't have also probably the support from your family, friends, and relatives. So all of these are, uh, for me, more important to talk about rather than, being asked by strangers or people I meet if I have already undergone these surgeries.
So that's actually, you mentioned, Popo, in terms of access. That's actually true. There are a lot of barriers. Uh, Even if, for example, somebody who identifies as trans wants to go for gender affirming surgery, there are so many barriers, especially in our context in the Philippines.
Mm,
One, of course, it's very expensive. It's not covered by insurance. So those who would want to do this definitely are those who have the means, who have the resources to do so. Okay, but does that mean that those who identify as trans, who do not have the resources, are not trans simply because of simply because they don't have the resources? It doesn't make them less of a woman or a man. Okay, so that's another layer. That's another issue altogether kumbaga. But our point really is that your physical makeup, your physiological makeup is not uh, the criterion for your gender identity. Again, I go back to my earlier point that when we talk about gender identity, this is very personal, this is very psychological. Only you, only the person can answer that.
Mm.
Regardless of what you have in your body, regardless of what other people say, what are you? Who are you? Are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you, are you neither? Are you both? Or something else? Okay, that is a very personal question. Okay? And in fact, if you actually think about questions about, about whether as somebody who identifies as trans has already undergone, gender affirming surgery, these are very, very personal and very intrusive questions, if I may add.
Yeah.
And
It's
we
actually
shouldn't really
rude
be
and impolite.
asking, yeah, we shouldn't be asking these questions, especially if, you're not even close with that person. And, we
Mm.
need to be careful when we have these conversations because we don't hold these conversations, let's say, with cisgender people or with straight people. That's not, something that we talk over dinner or at a party or something. So this is a very personal aspect of somebody else's life. So kumbaga, labas na tayo dun.
True.
Because again, our identity is a very personal, it's a very psychological matter.
Yeah. And in fact, it's quite dehumanizing or objectifying for people who don't understand you to think that you are sis, you are simply your organs. Your basis, the basis for your gender identity comes down to what you have down there, and that's not the case. And it's not as simple as that. It's not as easy to say as, yeah, I have one, or no, I have chopped it off already. It's not that simple, and it's very sensitive. It's a very sensitive topic for most trans people, if not all trans people. So yeah. Another thing that uh, people, LGBT people who are least represented in the community have to deal with is also uh, the problems when it comes to handling or dealing with relationships. And I think this is also another aspect of, the many myths surrounding the LGBT community that we should also tackle, having already talked about myths regarding gender identity, myths regarding, again, the least represented members of the community, and now we talk about myths about LGBT relationships. And in a same sex relationship, according to this myth, somebody assumes the female role while the other takes on the male role.
Yeah, so that's actually a that's actually a funny myth,
Yeah.
But again, the fact is that uh, same-sex relationships are not heterosexual relationships.
Mm.
Period. Okay? And again, if we were to unpack this particular myth, this really stems from our, heterosexist assumptions, ideas that all human relationships follow the patterns and roles of heterosexual relationships. So it's like we're using the lens of heterosexuality to investigate, evaluate, even to judge, the relationships of same-sex or same-gender couples. Okay? And that is why hindi tayo makalabas doon sa framing na yun. Na
Yeah.
even when you have a partnership between two men or two women, we still assume that somebody, is the quote unquote the male, somebody acts as the quote unquote female.
Yeah.
Okay. And um, that again points to our heterosexist assumptions. Okay? The point is, when you have two males in the relationship, they're both males. Okay? When you have two females, they're both females.
and it confuses a lot of people when they see two masculine people in a partnership or two feminine people in a relationship, and that's when they ask the silly question, so who's the girl, who's the boy? I actually encountered
Yeah,
this question in huh in while doing my graduate studies in Quezon City. So there was this instance when we were being told to do scene work of a particular play, and my classmate had to assume the role of a masculine character. And then someone pointed out, or someone just asked, uh, without hesitation, "Are you in a relationship?" And then my classmate said yes. And then this person asked him, or the follow up question was, in that case, who is the boy? Who's the girl in your relationship? Because uh, my classmate mentioned that he was with a guy. So the next question was, it surprised all of us in that room, and we simply kept quiet. I know it's wrong for us to, just look at each other silently without, helping this classmate of ours to, what's this, to not really defend himself, but to clarify this to a person who is very ignorant about the LGBT experience, that it doesn't have to be that way all the time. And that this pattern is one of the many reasons why we stay prejudiced towards members of the LGBT community, because we want things to follow certain structures or certain rules. And if they don't, then that's when we think they're wrong, they're bad, or they're evil, even.
yeah, and it's actually funny now that you mentioned that, Popo. This reminds me of this picture, actually a cartoon, um, that I found somewhere on the internet. So it was a picture of a pair of spoon and fork, and then there was a pair of chopsticks, and then
Mm,
the I think it was the spoon asked the chopsticks yung question was, so which is the spoon and which is the fork, diba? So parang it, so it's funny because kasi nga cartoon version siya,
mm,
but it's, if you really think about it, it's such an ignorant remark, understandable but ignorant remark
mm.
about same gender relationships. Again, because we live in a very heterosexist society, that we tend to assume that all relationships will always have, a party who plays the role of the man and another party plays the role of the woman. Okay, and that is a myth that we need to be that 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 we need to debunk. Okay, and in fact, this particular myth, if I may add, is also problematic even in heterosexual relationships. If
Mm.
you think about it, because the couple, the heterosexual couple, in a way, they become constrained in these expectations. So you have a couple, a woman and the man. Okay, so because we have societal expectations, the woman can only do certain tasks or certain activities, and the man can do this and that, but not this particular activity because of these restrictions. And if you think about it, for a lot of same sex or same gender relationships, wala yung ganong restrictions. Precisely
Walang
because
ganon, Mars.
walang ganon, Mars. That's true. Walang, and that's in a way that affords a lot of LGBT relationships a sense of freedom, if I may say, na walang
Mm.
ganong parang consideration that I have to act in a certain manner because this is what is expected of a heterosexual. relationship. So it's really, it's really problematic if you think about it.
Yeah, Sir Pierce, and to extend that idea of freedom or that misconception of freedom among people who are in a same gender relationship is also the idea that they have that much freedom to engage in sexual acts because they don't have the what's this? They don't have the fear of uh, getting someone pregnant, or they don't have the fear of what's this? Yeah, just getting someone pregnant, and with that, there is the idea that LGBT people are promiscuous. So that is the myth, Sir Pierce. What can
Yeah,
you say about that?
that's definitely a myth, because the fact is that LGBT people are neither more nor less sexually promiscuous than straight people or than heterosexuals. And again, because we are here trying to unpack and deconstruct these myths and misconceptions, this stems from the hypersexualization of LGBT people's lives and experiences. So usually when we talk about an LGBT identifying person, parang yung nakikita lang natin sa kanya is the sexual aspect, okay? Yung sexual behavior, sexual experiences. Okay? And we don't realize that there is so much more to that person than that person's sex life, which is to begin with a very private matter. Really. So I don't even know why people are so obsessed with why are people so obsessed with our sex lives, right? With LGBT people sex lives, with what goes on in the bedroom or where outside the
Whatever.
bedroom, wherever that happens, right? But the point is, there is so much more to us than our sexual activities. And if you think about it, the idea of promiscuity is highly problematic because one, how do you operationalize promiscuity in the first place? So what is the criteria
Yeah.
for judging? When do you say that someone is promiscuous? Is it what is it a
How do you
matter of
measure that? Yeah.
number of sexual partners, number of sexual experiences, and if it's a
Frequency?
number, yeah, what is the number? Is it like 1, 10, 20, 100? And who gets to set that particular number? So that's another question, right?
Hmm.
So it's really very problematic. And in fact, we can we can even ask. So when somebody says, uh, LGBT people are having a lot of sex, so what is the problem with that? No, I mean
True.
that's an individual decision. If that's as long as it's a consensual activity between two or even more adults, and
True.
hopefully it's a
Mm.
safe activity. There was no coercion involved. Who are we to say that? Who are we to impute value judgments to that particular activity? Kumbaga. And again, it goes back to you know, uh, our heterosexist assumptions. There's a lot of moralizing involved in that particular myth. Again, okay, na only LGBT people are promiscuous. But does that mean that straight people doesn't get a lot of
Action?
sex or
Yeah.
action
And
or however you want to call it?
does it mean also that gays, lesbians, transgenders, or bisexuals do not also want to remain celibate? Or does it also follow that
Yes, yes.
they don't want to engage in monogamous relationships because of the idea, because of the myth that uh, LGBT people are promiscuous? I don't think so. I think there are a lot of people who can also choose to remain to have multiple partners, and that's not a big deal. I don't think that's a problem.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
But again, admittedly, we live in a society that again is so heterosexist. With we have so many hang-ups when it comes to sex, sexuality, admittedly because of our culture, and part of that is really because of our religion. Okay, that we make other people's private business our business.
Correct.
Okay, and I really think there is something wrong with that. Okay, and that has to stop. Prying into people's private lives and judging people based on what they do based on their personal decisions. But to go back to that particular myth, it's a misconception, really. Because if you think about it, has anyone actually conducted a survey? Uh, because
And
if
is
you
that
want, if
survey
we
already over?
yeah, I mean, because if we wanted to be fair, we should ask everyone, straight people
True.
included.
Mm.
How many times have you had sex? How many partners have you had? Okay, and then we agree on certain parameters. Again, okay, if we were to operationalize promiscuity, which is really a very problematic concept, because when people ask that question, or quote unquote, accuse people of LGBT people of being promiscuous, if we turn the table around, we can also ask, well, but could it also be true that, you're asking that question simply because you're not having a lot of sex? Okay? Diba? And who are you to tell us,
Yeah.
okay, that we're having a lot of sex? Again, okay, and what is the cutoff? Really, I'm interested. Can somebody tell me? Because, as far as I know, there is no number out there. Okay, so whoever came up with this crazy idea really just wanted to malign LGBT people in general, and really paint
They
a
have
really
to get
bad,
a life.
yeah, they want to paint a bad picture when it comes to LGBT people's lives or sex lives in general.
But let me speculate about something, Sir Pierce, that's related to this myth. I'm thinking that since we live in a conservative society, that the LGBT community has very small circles, and this also is most likely true for even circles concerning sexual partners. And the tendency there is for, people keep on saying that, they tend to just switch it up. They tend to just exchange partners, and that one uh, friend's ex becomes that friend's current flame. And probably that adds to this myth because there's also that layer to promiscuity, sharing partners, perhaps. I don't know. What can you say about
Well,
this, Sir
yeah,
Pierce?
that's an interesting thought. No, and well, that's possible, really. But now that you brought up, our culture, the way we were socialized, uh, it's possible. But I'm also thinking it might also be because LGBT people uh, have more leeway, so to speak, uh, to talk about their sexual experiences.
Yeah.
Being unencumbered by the expectations that society places, for example, on straight people, especially straight women, okay, who are not supposed to have sex until they are married, okay, or who are supposed to only have sex with just one person, okay,
Yeah.
until the end of time, okay.
And
At
with
least that's the
the
script that is usually given to us,
intention
right?
of having a baby, right? Procreating.
Yeah, for procreation, okay. And so somebody, I would assume, who identifies as heterosexual, okay, who probably has a lot of sexual partners or have had a lot of sexual experiences, might not be inclined to talk about this even with his or her friends, because this person will be judged accordingly. Okay,
Mm.
but probably a lot of LGBT people are freer to talk about this, personal aspect of their lives, and then this gets magnified, okay, because we hear stories, and then these stories stick with us, okay, and then we generalize these stories to the whole LGBT population, and then you know these myths usually give birth to some other myths, and then they are self-perpetuating in a sense. And now we have that, silly idea of LGBT people being promiscuous individuals.
Okay, so in fact, we can actually say walang ganon Mars.
Walang ganun,
Walang
Mars.
ganon Mars. Right.
True.
Okay. So, and you mentioned, Sir Pierce, about the expectations of our very conservative society on women, on cisgender women or cisgender females, in that they are supposed to only engage in a sexual relationship with one partner, with once they get married, and with the intent of procreation. And that brings us the idea that only heterosexuals are fit to become parents, which then leads us to our next myth. And that's LGBT people are unfit to become parents themselves.
Yes, that's again a related myth, and sadly that's a myth that is so difficult to shatter, so to speak, precisely because we don't have a lot of LGBT parents who are out there in the open, and we can refer to them as an example. Okay, but if we refer to the literature, to the available literature, the fact is that studies have shown that children of LGBT parents are just as well adjusted as children of heterosexual couples. So it's not the sexual orientation or gender identity of parents, but the quality of parenting that determines the well-being of children. Okay? In fact, if I may cite an article by Charlotte Patterson, who is a psychologist. Okay, so she had this article published uh, entitled "Children of Lesbian and Gay Parents," and she tried to review studies on LGBT parents and parenting. And she concluded that more than 2 decades of research has failed to reveal important differences in the adjustment or development of children or adolescents reared by same sex couples compared to those reared by other sex couples or opposite sex couples. And results of the research suggest that qualities of family relationships are more tightly linked with child outcomes than is parental sexual orientation. So that's the very important ingredient, so to speak, when it comes to parenting, when it comes to being a good parent. Ultimately, it doesn't matter who you are, what your sexual orientation, gender identity is. What matters at the end of the day is the quality of parenting, the quality of relationship between the parent and the child or the children.
Mhm. Therefore, research has shown that the available data do not support negative stereotypes about same-sex parents. Am I right, Sir Pierce?
Yes, yes, that's
Okay.
that's that's true.
Mm.
Admittedly, many of these studies have been done in Western populations. Okay,
Mm.
but we also have to make that note. No, but if I may also speculate, even if we actually do a cross-cultural study, this particular finding will still hold true. Okay? Because even developmental psychologists have highlighted already the importance of the quality of relationship between parents and children
Mhm.
when it comes to the well-being of the child. Okay, so wala namang nagsasabi na it has something to do about the identity or the sexual orientation. Or if we were to make this as a personal exercise, even okay, because I remember I would I used to do this in one of my LGBT psych classes when we talk about this particular topic, when we talk about parenting. So I would ask them, so can you think of, one or two or even just uh, one thing that uh, uh, that your parents did, okay, or you think that your parents did right, okay, when you were growing up, that you would like to do or you would want to copy, quote unquote, when you become parents yourselves, okay, assuming you want to become parents, no? Or another way of framing that question is, what is one thing that
A
that you
practice.
feel, yeah, a practice, or it doesn't even have to be a practice. It's something that is in your memory, that you remember, is something that makes them good parents, basically, that makes your father and mother good parents, and then they will list these things down, okay, and none of them, nobody, okay, among my students ever mentioned their parents being straight, okay.
Mm.
Nobody mentioned gender identity. Nobody mentioned anything about sexual orientation. Nobody said, I'm very thankful for having
A
a
straight
straight
father.
father or a straight mother, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But what was a common theme in their answers really was, again, the quality of their relationship with their parents. Okay? They had warm, loving, supportive parents, and
Mm.
that says a lot, right?
Yeah.
About, if we want to have, healthy children, well developed children, okay, uh, we don't need to worry so much about one SOGIE. Okay? What
Yes.
we need to worry about really is the quality of our relationship, okay, with our children, basically.
What can you say then, sir, regarding this idea of being unfit parents that is probably associated with LGBT parents, in that there is a fear that the children raised by LGBT parents may end up gay or lesbian themselves? Or another point is, what can you say about uh, the this fear that if you are a child of an LGBT parent, or if your parents are both LGBT people, that you will encounter problems in forging or developing relationship with friends or peers, or even romantic relationships with other people?
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought it up, but I'd like to address the first one because I have to say that's, again, that's a myth. Yung
Mm.
just because you have same-sex or couple as a parent, so your parents, for example, are both men or both women, then you grow up to become LGBT yourself.
Yourself.
No,
Yeah.
that is definitely a myth, because if that were true, then all children of heterosexual couples should also be heterosexuals, right?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
correct. Mm.
But that doesn't happen. I mean, personally, for example, as far as I know, both my parents are straight. That is as far as I know. Again, I mean, both my parents are cisgender heterosexual people. Okay, and I'm a cisgender gay man. Okay, so that it doesn't follow really. Okay, so that is an unfounded idea. Na the orientation, the gender identity of your parents will also be the gender identity
Yeah.
and the sexual orientation of the children, because this doesn't happen, okay, to children of heterosexual couples.
Couples. Yeah.
In fact, if I were to, make, of course, this is an unwarranted guess, no? Most LGBT children or most LGBT people probably come from uh, straight parents or opposite sex couples, right? So that
Mm.
fact alone already uh, shatters that particular myth. Okay? And then what you mentioned, the second one, yung problems relating with friends or even having relationships, that is of course possible. Nobody is exempted from that. And again, I go back to the point that it's not because of your sexual orientation per se. Okay?
Mm.
Uh, while that could happen, for example, the child of uh, two lesbian mothers might encounter issues, having children, probably because this child is bullied in school, okay, or by her his or her playmates because yung kanyang mother ay parehong babae or parehong lalaki. Okay? And that's again because of the stigma associated with the sexual orientation, gender identity of the parents, but not because of who he or she is. Okay? But
Also,
it's wrong to assume that simply because your parents are both men and women, magiging problematic na yung iyong
yeah.
relationships.
So in that case, we can also proudly say walang ganon.
Walang ganong
Mars.
Mars. No?
Walang
And
ganon Mars.
yeah, talagang I know several LGBT parents, and for me, they're really doing such a great job. Unfortunately, yun nga, in terms of representation, we don't hear a lot of these stories. We don't have, they are not that represented in the mass media.
So I also would like to speculate on another question related to this myth. Can this myth actually do harm? The myth that LGBT people are unfit to become parents, can this myth actually do harm to the same sex marriage advocacy of LGBT people? And since I think this has been the common denominator in uh, this conversation, how we're trying to raise awareness about the LGBT community and, understand uh, gender identities and the issues that stem from confusion and ignorance about the LGBT experience, it's nice to end this discussion with myths or with one myth about LGBT advocacy, and that LGBT people and allied political organizations are asking for special rights.
Yes, this is actually a nice way of ending no, this
Yeah.
conversation, Popo. We're talking about, uh, our collective advocacy for equal rights, for well-being, for LGBT people. And unfortunately, there is a lot of that floating around on this particular myth about LGBT people asking for special rights. But the fact is that LGBT rights are human rights. Okay? And many LGBT persons, individuals, only want the same rights enjoyed by straight people. Okay? There is nothing special about, wanting to enjoy the right to be free from discrimination. Okay? Or wanting to, or there is nothing special about wanting to have the right to access basic social services that is accessible to the heterosexual population. Okay, that is probably not accessible to LGBT people, being marginalized uh, uh, sectors in our community. Okay, so walang ganon, walang ganon mga Mars, no? There, when we talk about rights and equality, hindi po siya yung if we have laws and policies to protect the rights of LGBT people, it doesn't necessarily mean na you're taking away the rights of straight people. You're simply distributing these rights for our society to be more equitable, for it to be fairer, to be more humane, which is really how all societies should be in the first place. Okay? And in fact, you mentioned earlier yung SOGIE bill, which has been languishing in Congress for for about 2 decades now, uh, yung palagi yung ginagamit, 'di ba, na na statement na parang why
Special,
are
extra,
yeah,
maarte.
what's so special about LGBT people? But the fact is, there is really a lot of discrimination, prejudice that's deeply rooted in our society. And by the way, that bill, the SOGIE bill, uh, aims to protect everyone, okay? Not just LGBT people. It's not only for LGBT people because everyone has SOGIE, including straight people. Okay? So everyone is covered by that particular bill. Okay? So it's not a special bill for LGBT people alone. Okay? So that's
Mm.
for everybody. Really.
Okay. So that was a very fruitful discussion, Sir Pierce. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for being part of this episode of Manabana. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Popo, for this very engaging conversation. And thank you, of course, to Bate UP Tacloban for this, platform, which is, very commendable, I would say. And I think I'd just like to end by saying that we need to keep this conversation going. In fact, this is really part of the Living Gender conversation series. Okay, so this conversation doesn't stop here. Okay, but I'd like to invite everyone to, personally reflect on all the other myths and misconceptions that we were not able to cover in this episode, and be more critical, and try to deconstruct the meanings behind these myths. And it's also nice to ask people if you feel like that you don't understand certain things. That's okay. There's no shame in that, and this episode is doing just that. And at the end of the day, when we understand LGBT people, we understand the fullness of their lives, and when we advocate for LGBT people's rights and well-being, ultimately everyone benefits. Okay, regardless of whether you're straight or you're LGBT. Okay, the whole society really benefits when we have happy, healthy, and well developed members of our community. So thank you very much again, Popo, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir, and for your research pursuits and advocacies relating to the LGBT community. Mabuhay ka and good luck. So, again, this was Walang Ganon Mars, Myths and Misconceptions about LGBT people. This has been Popo Amascual, and have a lovely afternoon, everyone.